I came home without warning after completing my last mission and found my son agonizing alone in the intensive care unit. My daughter-in-law was celebrating on a yacht. So I froze all her accounts. An hour later, she went crazy. The wheels of the aircraft screeched softly against the tarmac as John Matthews stepped off the plane, his boots touching American soil for the first time in over a year. The sun was just beginning to dip behind the skyline of Washington, casting a burnt orange glow across the airport runway. John didn't alert anyone of his return. No calls, no messages. After decades of covert operations and international conflict zones, his instinct remained, always come home quiet. The man who once intercepted global threats without blinking now carried a suitcase in one hand and a hollow weight in his chest. This mission had been his last. Retirement wasn't a choice, it had been forced by age, protocol, and the simple truth that he was tired. Tired of watching men fall. Tired of holding back truths. Tired of silence. He had imagined this homecoming for months. He'd walk through the door of his modest townhouse, be greeted by his son, David, maybe share a beer in the backyard. Emily, his daughter-in-law, might fuss over dinner or complain gently about John's stubborn quietness. It would be normal. Mundane. The kind of domestic peace he never thought he would crave, but now clung to like a lifeline. Instead, his instincts screamed at him the moment he arrived at his empty home. No cars in the driveway. No lights on inside. A layer of dust on the windowsill spoke of absence, not just forgetfulness. He tried calling David, straight to voicemail. He called again. Then Emily. Her phone rang, but no answer. Minutes turned into an hour as he searched through the messages piling in his inbox. Buried under military updates and formal congratulations was a single hospital email, dated 4 days prior, marked urgent. Patient, David Matthews, Intensive Care Unit, Georgetown Medical Center. Emergency contact unreachable. Seeking next of kin. John felt his heartbeat falter. He read it 3 more times to make sure. Then, without changing clothes or unpacking, he got in a rental car and headed straight to the hospital, the message still open on his phone screen. By the time he reached the ICU wing, it was past 9 o'clock in the evening. The halls were eerily quiet, polished floors reflecting the sterile blue lighting. At the front desk, a tired nurse lifted her head as John approached. "I'm John Matthews. I'm here to see my son." "David Matthews," he said, his voice calm but firm. The nurse blinked, then typed something into the computer. "You're his father?" "Yes." Her tone softened slightly. "No one's come to see him in a few days. He's in room 17. Down the hall and to the left." Her words echoed in his head. No one's come to see him. The hallway felt endless. Each step pressed against his chest like lead. As he turned the corner, he spotted the room. 17. The door was ajar. Machines beeped in slow rhythm inside. David lay pale, motionless, hooked up to tubes and monitors. His chest rose and fell with machine assistance. Bruises bloomed across his arms. A stitched wound marked his forehead. There were no flowers. No cards. No signs of recent visitors. Only the steady hum of life being maintained artificially. John's hand gripped the edge of the bed as he leaned in. His son looked older, thinner, fragile in a way that didn't make sense for someone in his early 30s. He was supposed to be healthy, married, building a future. "What happened to you?" John whispered. He looked around again. Not even a chair was out of place. Everything was cold and untouched. A nurse entered briefly to check the machines. John turned to her. "How long has he been like this?" She checked her chart. "He was admitted 5 days ago. Car accident. Head trauma, internal injuries. We stabilized him, but he hasn't woken up. Has anyone been visiting him?" The nurse hesitated. "You're the first I've seen. We tried calling the emergency contact several times. There was no answer. He didn't ask for clarification. He already knew who that contact was. Emily. His mind began to churn. If David had been hospitalized for 5 days, and no one had visited, where the hell was she? Where was the woman who vowed to love and protect his son? John's hands clenched at his sides. He had survived war zones less cruel than this sterile, empty room. The nurse gave a sympathetic nod and exited. John sat beside his son, eyes locked on the motionless face. His thoughts, however, raced far beyond the hospital walls. Something was wrong. Something deeper than an accident. He would find out what it was. And he would do it without making a sound. He had returned in silence. But he would not remain silent for long. John Matthews didn't sleep that night. He remained seated in the hard plastic chair beside his son's hospital bed, watching the slow, mechanical rise and fall of David's chest. Outside the ICU window, the sky shifted from a deep purple to a pale gray as dawn approached, but nothing changed inside the room. The monitors beeped steadily. The drip continued its silent rhythm. And David didn't move. Not once. A different nurse came in around 6 o'clock in the morning, offering John coffee, which he took without a word. He asked no questions and answered none. His mind was working, measuring, calculating. Something had already broken loose inside him, and it was no longer just a father's worry, it was the alert of a trained intelligence officer sensing a story that didn't add up. At 8 o'clock, the attending physician finally arrived. He was a composed, well-groomed man in his 50s named Dr. Halpern. He greeted John with a firm handshake and a professional calm that John didn't appreciate. "Your son's condition has remained stable through the night," Dr. Halpern said. "No improvements yet, but no further deterioration. We're monitoring for signs of neurological response. Has there been any movement at all? Eye flutter, muscle twitch, anything?" "Minimal. Reflexive only. Nothing indicating full consciousness." John nodded, jaw tight. "I'm told no one's visited him since he was admitted," John said, his voice low but direct. Dr. Halpern's gaze flicked away briefly. "We've reached out to his listed emergency contact, his wife, several times. No response. No visits. We can't compel family members to show up, unfortunately." "Did she know the extent of his injuries?" John asked. "She was informed. We left 3 messages. We assumed she was processing, or perhaps out of town." John said nothing. That was the first confirmation Emily had been told. She had known. And still, she had chosen to stay away. After the doctor left, John rose and exited the room. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them watching machines breathe for his son. He walked down the hall, searching for someone who might provide information. At the nurse's station, he found a young nurse reviewing a clipboard. She looked up and gave a tired smile. "Can I help you, sir? I'm David Matthews's father. I need to know who signed him in. Who brought him here?" The nurse checked the system. He was brought in by ambulance after a car crash on the Beltway. No one accompanied him. He was unconscious on arrival. The paramedics reported it was a single-vehicle collision. He went off the road, hit a barrier. Were there any items with him? A phone? Yes, a phone and wallet. Both logged with security. You can request to retrieve them. I will. Anything else? John hesitated. Do you remember if anyone visited him at all? Even once? The nurse frowned and shook her head. Not that I've seen. I've been on this wing since the weekend. It's mostly been just him and us. He thanked her, took the hospital form required to retrieve David's belongings, and made his way down to the secure storage department. 20 minutes later, he was holding a sealed plastic bag containing a cracked iPhone and a scuffed leather wallet. In the hospital's quiet family lounge, John sat alone and turned on the phone. The screen lit up, password protected. But it took him less than a minute to bypass the security using methods he had once taught other operatives. The device unlocked with a faint buzz. He went straight to the recent call log. The last outgoing call was 5 days ago, 32 minutes before the crash. The number was labeled simply, Lisa. The call had lasted 1 minute and 11 seconds. John noted the time. Then he opened David's messages. There were dozens of unread texts from John himself, mostly asking when he'd be free for a call, a drink, a dinner. No replies. Then he scrolled to Emily's message thread. The last message she had sent David was 3 days before the crash. It read, "You don't get to control my life just because you're feeling insecure. I told you I need space. Don't make this harder." There were no replies from David. The message before that, from him, read, "Please just talk to me. I know something's going on." John set the phone down for a moment, letting the silence press in. He wasn't interested in drawing conclusions, not yet, but the pattern was emerging. Distance. Evasion. Conflict. And now, abandonment. He returned to the phone and opened the photo gallery. The last picture was taken on the morning of the crash. A blurry image of a handwritten note on a napkin. John zoomed in. The handwriting was David's. It read, "If anything happens to me, ask Lisa." John's breath caught. He took a photo of the screen with his own phone and stored it carefully. Next, he went through the wallet. Driver's license, credit cards, insurance card. Tucked behind one of the flaps was a folded receipt from a restaurant in Georgetown, dated the same morning as the crash. It was for 2 meals and 2 drinks. Paid in cash. He slid the receipt into his pocket. Before returning to David's room, he stopped by the hospital cafe and ordered a sandwich he wouldn't eat. He sat at a table by the window, watching the morning traffic outside. The gears in his mind were now fully engaged. David had been trying to talk to someone. He'd been asking questions, confronting something. He was reaching out. And Emily had told him to stop. John no longer believed in coincidence. He returned to the ICU just as a nurse was adjusting David's IV. "I need to ask you something," John said quietly to her. "Has there been any record of someone trying to check in or call about transferring David to another facility?" The nurse frowned, clearly surprised by the question. She checked the chart, then clicked through the electronic records. There was a note in the system. A request for information was made 2 days ago about private transport. But it didn't go through. It was flagged for lack of proper authorization. Who made the request? The nurse tapped a few more keys. It came from a call. The caller identified herself as Emily Matthews. John's jaw tightened. Was she here in person? No. It was a phone inquiry. They asked for detailed medical records and a list of private care clinics. "Thank you." John waited until she left the room again. Then he sat beside his son, staring at his unconscious face for a long moment. "She tried to move you," he said softly. "Out of here. Without telling anyone. Without seeing you." He leaned closer. "I don't know what's going on yet, but I will." As the sun rose higher and light filled the room, the contrast between the sterile calm of the ICU and the storm building inside John Matthews could not have been greater. He now had a mission. And this time, the battlefield was his own family. The rental car moved steadily down the highway as John Matthews drove south, the early afternoon sun glinting off the windshield. He had left David's hospital room after ensuring no immediate changes were expected and had given the nurse his personal number, instructing her to call at any hour if his son's condition shifted. His mind was locked into a different task now. The photo of the yacht, posted on social media just hours earlier, was still fresh in his memory, a floating stage of laughter and luxury, with Emily at its center. He had recognized her instantly. Champagne glass in hand, oversized sunglasses perched atop her face, surrounded by men and women laughing under the Florida sun. Her expression wasn't grief. It wasn't concern. It was celebration. It had taken him less than an hour to trace the image back to a tagged guest. From there, he tracked the boat, rented, not owned, and confirmed it had departed from a private dock in Miami just the day before. The yacht, called the Aqua Rain, was listed on a luxury charter site. Bookings were traceable. Names were traceable. Emily Matthews had paid in advance using a joint account under her and David's names. John's fingers curled against the steering wheel as the implications settled deeper. While his son lay unconscious and alone, she was floating in the sun, drinking champagne purchased with his money. By the time he arrived at the marina, the sky had shifted into late afternoon gold. Palm trees swayed lazily along the waterline. The harbor smelled of salt and diesel. Sleek, white vessels bobbed gently in place, and laughter drifted from onboard decks. It felt worlds apart from the sterile air of the ICU. John parked and walked calmly toward the main dock office. Inside, a bored young woman looked up from her tablet. "Can I help you?" "Yes. I'm looking for a charter currently in dock." "The Aqua Rain." The woman blinked, then glanced at her screen. "It's out right now. Expected back within the hour." "Who made the reservation?" "I'm sorry, we can't release that information." John didn't raise his voice. He simply held her gaze a moment longer than she expected, long enough for her to falter. She turned her screen slightly. It was booked by Emily Matthews. "Thank you." He left the office, stepped out into the fading light, and stood on the dock. His hands slipped into the pockets of his jacket, where his phone rested, recording, documenting, prepared. He waited. 40 minutes later, the Aqua Rain rounded the pier and slowly pulled in. The music was still playing, though low. People stood on deck, holding drinks, snapping photos. Among them was Emily. She was laughing, her head tilted back, lips glossy. Her sundress fluttered in the breeze. She looked younger than John remembered her, unburdened. When the boat docked and guests began disembarking, John remained still. He watched her thank the captain, pose for one last selfie, and finally step onto the dock. It wasn't until she was a dozen feet away that she saw him. Her body jolted as if hit by a silent shockwave. She froze, color draining from her face. "John?" He said nothing. Her lips parted again, trying to conjure a smile. "I didn't know you were back." He took a slow step forward. "Clearly." Emily adjusted her sunglasses, suddenly aware of how exposed she was. Her posture changed. "What are you doing here?" she asked, now quieter. "I could ask you the same." I needed a break. Everything's been overwhelming." John tilted his head slightly. "Overwhelming?" "I've been dealing with everything on my own," she said, glancing around as the last few guests moved out of earshot. "David's situation has been complicated." "You were notified of the accident?" "Yes, of course I was, but—" "And you never went to the hospital?" "Not once." "I couldn't, John. I needed time to process. I've been under so much stress, and I didn't know how to save it." She blinked, stunned by the interruption. John took out his phone and showed her the bank notifications. Each one listed a purchase made from the shared account over the past 3 days. Hotel. Catering. Yacht deposit. Designer boutique. "I froze every one of your accounts," he said. "An hour ago. Everything under your name. Everything under David's name you've had access to." "You what?" she snapped, voice rising. "You heard me. You can't do that." "I just did." Her face shifted, first disbelief, then panic, then fury. "You don't have the right." "Actually, I do. David's medical power of attorney was filed at the hospital after your absence. And there are documents. Signed. Dated. Changing everything." She took a step forward, her expression hardening. "This is illegal. You have no idea what you're doing. I'll call a lawyer." "You should. Maybe he'll explain how a yacht party during your husband's coma plays in court." She hesitated. Her eyes narrowed. You think you're better than me because you were some kind of spy? Don't come in here pretending to know what's best for David. I don't pretend. I find facts. And the facts tell me you haven't been acting like a wife. For a second, the fury in her face flickered into something else, uncertainty. Fear. She turned to leave, but John stopped her. One more thing. Who's Lisa? Emily froze mid-step. He watched the tension ripple through her shoulders before she masked it. I don't know who you're talking about. You do. David called her the morning of the accident. 32 minutes before the crash. 1 minute, 11 seconds. He wrote a note that said, if anything happens to me, ask Lisa. She stared at him, lips slightly parted. He waited. Then, finally, she spoke. She's someone he used to work with. I don't know her. I only met her once. But you knew about her. She's nothing. Just some woman he ran into again recently. You jealous, Emily? Don't be ridiculous. He took a step back. You should leave Miami. Go back to wherever it is you're hiding from this mess. Because I promise you, if you stand in my way again, if you try to move David, touch another dollar, or lie to me again, I won't just freeze your accounts. Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, surrounded by the dying sun and the bitter remains of her celebration. Back in his car, John exhaled for the first time in hours. The truth wasn't just floating on a yacht. It was buried in conversations, in bank records, in the silence Emily couldn't explain. And he had only just begun to dig. John Matthews returned to Washington before sunrise the next day, the flight quiet and uneventful, but his mind constantly running scenarios. He had crossed a line by confronting Emily face to face in Miami, and he knew it. But she had already crossed several herself. What came next couldn't be reactionary, it had to be surgical. Calculated. He was no longer just a retired agent. He was a father standing at the edge of something rotten, and he would take it apart piece by piece. At a small cafe near the hospital, John sat with his laptop and a second burner phone he had reactivated for just this situation. Using secure networks and rerouted proxies, he began the first wave of operations. The goal wasn't to just retaliate, it was to strip Emily's ability to move unseen. He logged into David's financial portal first. There, he confirmed the joint accounts, 2 checking, 1 savings, a brokerage, and a credit line. One by one, he initiated lockdown protocols through a series of legal access points David had once granted him in the event of medical emergencies. While most spouses might contest such actions, Emily hadn't appeared or registered at the hospital since the crash. Her negligence was leverage. Next, he submitted a fraud alert to all major credit bureaus under David's name, halting any new lines of credit or suspicious activity. Then, John turned to the accounts Emily had opened under her maiden name. Using financial insight and archived data David had shared in past conversations, he found bank transfers matching purchases on the yacht and luxury hotel in Miami. Many were routed through apps and fintech services, easier to exploit, harder to trace. But he had what he needed. Each digital trail was a thread. With each account frozen, John took screenshots, documented timestamps, and began building a timeline. His next move required precision, so he reached out to an old contact, Veronica Chen, a former cybersecurity expert for a federal contractor, now freelancing. He sent her a single encrypted message: I need full activity logs on a subject. Discreet. No questions. High urgency. Veronica responded within minutes. Name and last 4 digits of SSN. He sent them. While she began digging, John returned to the hospital. The staff had become used to his presence. One nurse even nodded with a faint smile as he passed. David's condition hadn't changed, but a note from the neurologist indicated minor fluctuations in brain activity, an encouraging sign, though still inconclusive. John sat at the edge of the bed again, phone in hand, reviewing Emily's last 36 hours. Her social media had gone dark after their confrontation. No stories, no photos, no comments. But John didn't need her to post. He needed her to panic. And based on the sudden spike in declined transactions on her cards, he had confirmation that the chaos had begun. A private message came through the encrypted app. "Veronica, you were right. She's been moving money. Routing through dummy accounts. Transferring assets. I traced a real estate transaction in Maryland under the name Melissa Grant, same DOB as Emily Matthews. It closed 4 months ago." John's eyes narrowed. A second property. Hidden. Paid for from accounts linked to David. "John, send the deed. And dig into recent utilities or tenant listings." "Veronica, already on it. One more thing, you're not the only one watching her. Someone else queried her financials last week. Source unknown. Cloaked IP." He stared at that line. It was unexpected. Another player? That meant either Emily was under surveillance, or someone else had reason to watch her too. Someone who might not want John involved. The puzzle was growing. Back at his apartment, John converted the living room into a small operations center. Whiteboard on the wall, photos pinned to corners, threads drawn between Emily, David, the alias, the Miami expenses, and now this hidden house in Maryland. He marked each point of evidence with colored tape. Emily's phone had gone dark since Miami. She hadn't responded to any of his silent prods, no calls, no texts. Not even the baited emails he sent from a dummy account suggesting financial offers. She was retreating. That could mean fear, or planning. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, his phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Matthews? We have a situation." John was already grabbing his coat. "What happened?" "A woman came in, claiming to be David's wife. She attempted to override your access to his chart." "Was it Emily?" "Yes. We denied the request. Security escorted her out. But she was insistent." John's jaw locked. "Send me the incident report." As he drove, he played out her moves. She had gone silent, then tried to seize back control through official channels, banking, medical. When that failed, she returned to the hospital hoping to leverage legal spousal status. But she had overplayed her hand. The staff knew who had been by David's side every day. She hadn't appeared once until now, and that counted for more than a marriage license. At the hospital, he was handed a printed report detailing the encounter. Emily had shown up in person, demanded access to medical records, and requested David be moved to another facility, again. The name of the clinic she mentioned was a private center known for rapid, discreet patient turnover. John now had confirmation. She wasn't just trying to flee, she was trying to disappear him. He spent the next several hours reviewing footage from the hospital's security cameras. Emily's posture, her face, the way she demanded without grieving. It was all evidence. Not emotional, but tactical. Calculated. She wasn't acting out of loss. She was acting like someone trying to protect an investment. And then the final piece came from Veronica. She liquidated a personal account 3 days before the crash. $72,000. Transferred to an account in the Cayman Islands. That account now shows movement, money withdrawn last night. Multiple ATM attempts today denied. John read it again. Emily had been preparing to run. She had prepared for David's absence before the accident ever happened. And now, her escape routes were collapsing, one by one. He stood at the center of the room, eyes on the board, lines and dots circling like targets. Everything was connected. Every lie, every transfer, every calculated move. And now Emily was backed into a corner. Exactly where he needed her to be. The ringtone echoed across John Matthews's apartment, sharp and deliberate in the quiet that had settled over the evening. He stood by the window, staring out into the darkened street below, the phone vibrating insistently on the counter beside him. It was the burner line. He'd only given that number to one person, Emily. He let it ring 3 more times before answering. He didn't speak. The silence on the other end cracked first. "You've lost your mind," Emily's voice spat, controlled fury pulsing beneath her words. "You froze every single account. You humiliated me at the hospital. And now you're what, playing God over David's life?" Still, John said nothing. He wanted her to keep talking. People reveal more when they try to justify themselves. "You think you're punishing me, but you're hurting David too. Those funds, some of them were for his private care. His future. You don't know what you're doing." "You're right," he said finally, voice calm. "I don't know what I'm doing. I've only been here. Every day. Watching my son breathe through a machine. Watching doctors hope he'll twitch a finger. While you party on yachts and transfer money to islands. That money was mine," she snapped. "Legally? Maybe. Morally? No. Don't moralize me, John. You don't know our marriage." "You're right again," he said. "But I know my son. And he didn't trust you. He was scared. I've read the texts. I've seen the account logs. And I know about Lisa." The name hit its mark. A pause followed, taut and trembling with restrained emotion. "You don't know anything about her. I know David called her right before the crash. I know he left a note with her name on it. And I know you tried to move him. Twice. Without authorization. Why? You want answers?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're in way over your head. You think this is just about money? Then tell me what it's about." "Go to hell, John." The line went dead. John lowered the phone slowly, then set it down. The first call had come. Not a confession, not clarity, but emotion. Panic. That was the first crack. The next day, he contacted the clinic Emily had attempted to transfer David to. Using a lawyer friend's credentials and a few careful fabrications, he confirmed that the facility had indeed received a preliminary inquiry, one that included a down payment and a proposed transport date. The payment hadn't gone through, thanks to the frozen accounts. The transport date, however, had been scheduled for 2 days from now. Emily had planned to move David quietly and permanently. John's next step was to push further into the details she didn't want him to see. He returned to Veronica, who had been tracking new digital footprints. "She's gotten sloppy," Veronica reported over a secure line. 2 failed login attempts into her offshore accounts last night. Then a message from her to a contact labeled ES that rang a bell. Who is ES? Eric Sullivan. Former insurance broker. Lost his license 5 years ago. He specializes in high-risk payouts and back-channel estate management. And get this, he filed a life insurance claim under David's name last week. With Emily as beneficiary. John went still. What kind of policy? Accidental death. Signed 3 months ago. Retroactively tied to a new joint policy covering car-related fatalities. How much? $1.5 million. His hand gripped the edge of the desk. So that was it. A crash. A coma. A payout waiting on confirmation of death. And all Emily had to do was wait, or push. "Send me everything," John said. She did. John printed it all. The policy copy. The payment records. The attempted claim. The contact information for Sullivan, who had already gone underground once his name was flagged by financial regulators. Later that evening, John returned to the hospital. David's room was unchanged, lights low, machine steady. But there was a presence there now. A weight to the silence. A realization. She had planned his death. And now she was losing control. A nurse stepped in quietly to check the monitors, then paused. "There was a call earlier," she said. "Someone asked about visitation hours. Gave a false name. But we traced the number. It was routed from a Miami hotel. Emily was still trying to get in. John nodded once and thanked her. He stayed until late, then drove back to his apartment. He didn't sleep. He reviewed every document again. Every transaction. Every call. Every email from the insurance broker. The pieces no longer pointed to neglect, they pointed to premeditation. And then came the second message. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a text. You don't know what you're doing. If David wakes up and remembers what happened, it's not just my life that gets ruined. Be careful where you dig. He stared at the message, reread it twice. If David wakes up and remembers. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. She hadn't expected him to survive. But he had. And she was running out of time. It was close to 3 o'clock in the morning when John Matthews found himself standing alone in David's townhouse, the place dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner of the living room. He had used the emergency key David once gave him, still hidden under the fake stone near the front porch. The air inside was stale, undisturbed. Dust covered the shelves. A pair of worn shoes sat untouched by the door. The house hadn't been lived in for weeks. Everything in the living room remained just as he remembered: minimalist furniture, framed photographs of vacations and family gatherings, and a faint trace of lavender from one of Emily's air diffusers. John's eyes moved slowly over the space, searching not for comfort, but for inconsistencies. He was no longer just a father. He was an investigator. And now, the house had become a crime scene in everything but legal terms. He walked past the couch and opened the cabinet below the television. Inside, stacks of neatly labeled folders, mostly utilities and home documents. Tidy. Predictable. Then he moved toward the study. David's home office was less pristine: papers, cords, and notebooks scattered across the desk and shelves. It had the chaos of someone mid-crisis. John didn't need to be told his son had been unraveling. The room spoke louder than words. He opened David's laptop, still on the desk. The screen was locked, but John bypassed it with ease. Within minutes, he was inside. The browser history was telling: several searches related to financial fraud, estate law, and rights of a spouse in medical emergencies. One tab was still open in an incognito window, displaying a forum thread about hidden assets and how to detect undisclosed property ownership. David had been looking for something. Something he suspected Emily was hiding. John copied the browser data onto a flash drive, then checked the emails. Buried among subscription notices and bank alerts was a single unsent draft. Its subject line was empty. The body of the message read: "Lisa, if I don't show up tomorrow, it's because I was right. You were right. I think she knows I've been digging. I just need confirmation. One more conversation. If I make it back, we talk. If I don't, give this to someone you trust." There was no attachment. No recipient. Just words that were never sent. John saved it, then stood in silence, heart heavier than before. His son had been afraid, and he hadn't told anyone. Except Lisa. As dawn crept in, John turned his attention to the bedroom. He stepped cautiously into the space David and Emily had shared. A framed wedding photo sat on the nightstand. The bed was made, undisturbed. He opened the closet. David's side was still full. Emily's, however, had clear gaps: missing shoes, missing bags. She had packed before the crash. Inside the dresser, John found something unexpected. Tucked beneath a pile of scarves was a manila envelope sealed with tape. He peeled it open and pulled out a series of printed documents: scans of bank transfers, real estate contracts, and a signed power of attorney naming Emily as David's representative. But the signature was wrong. John could see it instantly. David's handwriting had always had a distinct loop in his M. This one didn't. It was forged. John took a photo and then replaced everything carefully. He needed proof, not destruction. By mid-morning, he met again with Veronica. They sat in the corner of a quiet diner off a suburban road, away from watchful eyes. She wore a plain hoodie and glasses, blending into the background with the ease of someone used to being invisible. "I've been reviewing everything you sent," she said, sipping black coffee. The offshore accounts weren't just Emily's. They were structured through 3 shell companies. 2 of them were dissolved last year. One is still active, under a name that appears on your documents. "Melissa Grant," John said. She nodded. "But here's the twist. That identity's been used before, in connection with a Miami-based law firm that handles shadow trusts." I dug deeper. Guess who signed the founding papers of one of those trusts? Emily? No. Her cousin. Evan Stratton. John frowned. Never heard of him. He's a CPA with no criminal record. But his online presence is clean. Too clean. No political opinions. No social media activity. And one interesting detail, he used to work at the same brokerage that handles high-value insurance portfolios. Including David's. John leaned back. The network was growing. So she wasn't just moving money, he said. She was building a firewall. She had help, Veronica added. And possibly not just from Evan. Some of the transfers were approved through a secondary signature, initials ES. Eric Sullivan. Veronica nodded. Everything's pointing to a coordinated setup. David wasn't just paranoid. He was targeted. John took out the forged signature photo and laid it on the table. This was in their bedroom. A forged power of attorney. She tried to use it to move him without going through the hospital. That failed. So she tried again. Then she started prepping the insurance claim. Veronica's eyes narrowed. She was preparing for him to die. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of it settle. "I'll keep pulling records," Veronica said. "But if you're going to confront her again..." "I'm not," John interrupted. "Not yet. I want her to make the next move." He stood, left cash on the table, and walked out. That evening, John received a call from the hospital. David had shown minor voluntary movement in his right hand during a routine check. No response to voice. No eye movement. But it was a start. A sign that he was still there. That he was fighting. John stood at his son's bedside for a long time, watching the quiet strength beneath the wires and tape. Then he whispered. "She's not going to win." Later that night, John received an anonymous email from a server in the Cayman Islands. Subject: "Be careful who you trust. Some enemies wear familiar faces." Attached was a scanned file, an internal memo from a financial firm flagging unusual activity from a U.S. citizen under investigation for insurance fraud. The name? Evan Stratton. And just like that, the circle began to tighten. The following morning, Washington was cloaked in a soft, persistent drizzle, and the city's rhythm seemed slightly muffled under the gray sky. But John Matthews moved with quiet determination through the heavy front doors of a nondescript brick building tucked between law offices and antique shops near DuPont Circle. It was a private firm, now owned by a retired FBI analyst named Mark Rayner, a man John had worked with years ago during a covert operation in Eastern Europe. Mark owed him a favor. Today, John intended to collect. The waiting room was small and silent, with walls lined in muted beige and the scent of old leather lingering in the air. Moments later, Mark emerged from a back hallway, his presence as firm and composed as ever. Though his hair had grayed considerably, his eyes retained the same forensic sharpness John remembered. "John Matthews," he said with a grin that quickly faded when he saw John's expression. "This isn't a social call, is it?" "Not today," John replied. "I need someone with access to background systems. Not official channels. Quiet work." Mark led him to a small conference room and shut the door behind them. "Tell me everything." John did. The yacht, the hospital, the frozen accounts, the hidden trust under an alias, the forged signature, the insurance claim. He laid out the entire web Emily had constructed, along with the supporting documents, some physical, others digital. When he finished, Mark sat back in silence, the weight of the story settling between them. "That's more than fraud," Mark finally said. "You're looking at potential conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, financial misappropriation, possibly attempted murder if a prosecutor's bold enough." "I don't need a prosecutor yet," John said. "I need information. I need to know who's protecting her. Who else is in on this? She's made moves that suggest she's not acting alone. I think there's more." Mark nodded, then picked up the file containing Evan Stratton's name. "This guy's our entry point," he said. "I'll put him through all the unofficial databases. If he has connections to other flagged individuals, I'll find them." John stood. "I'll give you 48 hours. As John left the firm and walked back into the rain-soaked street, his phone vibrated. A message from Veronica had just come through. David had a second phone. Found the number through a backup on his laptop. Tracing now. John's pace slowed. A second phone meant private conversations that might explain the growing paranoia David felt before the crash. He replied immediately. Find out who he called most. Prioritize last 3 weeks before the accident. That evening, Veronica sent a full report. Most frequent contact, Lisa Chen. Number traced to a residential address in Arlington. Registered under her name. No criminal record. Profession, environmental engineer. Same company David consulted for 6 months ago. Lisa. The name that kept surfacing in whispers and shadows. The woman David tried to call just before the crash. The woman Emily tried to erase with silence. John didn't hesitate. He drove to the address immediately. The apartment building was modest, red brick, 3 floors with small balconies. Lisa lived on the second. He knocked once. Then again. Finally, the door opened slightly, chain still on. A cautious pair of eyes met his. Lisa Chen? He asked gently. Who's asking? My name is John Matthews. David is my son. The door closed for a second. Then, after a pause, the chain slid off. She opened it fully, revealing a woman in her early 30s, face drawn and tense, dressed in a soft sweater and jeans. She gestured for him to enter. I was wondering when someone would come, she said quietly as he stepped inside. I saw the news about the crash. But I didn't know how to reach you. You were the last person he called. Lisa nodded, eyes misty. I think he knew something was coming. He was scared. Not just of Emily. Of what she might do. He told me he'd found something, financial documents, signatures that didn't match. He thought someone was helping her move his money behind his back. He was right. Lisa sat on the edge of her couch. He was trying to build a case. He didn't want to go to the police until he had proof. He said if he was wrong, it could destroy his marriage. But if he was right. John nodded. Then it could cost him his life. She stared at him, trembling. Do you think the accident wasn't an accident? I think someone was counting on him not surviving it. Lisa's face crumpled slightly at the edges, but she held it together. He never told me everything. Just pieces. But I know he had files. On a drive. He said he kept it separate. Not on his laptop. John straightened. Do you know where? Lisa hesitated, then walked to a small wooden cabinet. She pulled out a USB flash drive. He gave this to me the week before. Told me not to open it unless something happened. I didn't know what to do with it. I was afraid. John took it, his hand steady. You did the right thing. Back at his apartment, John loaded the drive onto a clean, isolated device. It was encrypted, but he cracked it in less than an hour. Inside were scans of bank records, recorded conversations between David and Emily, and spreadsheets tracking unexplained withdrawals. But one folder stood out, labeled E. Inside were photos, Emily and Evan Stratton, together at a private dinner. Emily signing documents at a brokerage. A copy of the life insurance policy with altered dates. Surveillance photos. David had been documenting everything. He had built a file, ready to expose it all. And someone had tried to silence him. John now had enough for the authorities. Enough for the media. Enough for anyone. But he wasn't finished. He wanted to know who ordered the final push. Who signed off on the crash. That would come next. He would find them. And they would answer. The morning David was intubated again began quietly. There was no dramatic shift in the air, no sudden alarms, just a subtle change in his vital signs. The attending nurse noticed the decline during a routine check. His breathing had become more erratic, and his oxygen saturation levels had dropped slowly but consistently throughout the night. John was not at the hospital when the call came. He was reviewing the contents of David's encrypted drive with Veronica in a secure location. The nurse's voice was calm, clinical, but urgent. "Mr. Matthews, there's been a complication. David's condition has worsened. He's been reintubated. I think you should come in." John didn't speak for a few seconds. Then he stood without a word and left everything behind, papers, laptop, coffee still steaming. By the time he arrived, the ICU room was filled with the low hum of advanced respiratory equipment. David lay once again under the weight of tubes and sedation. The neurologist met John in the hallway. Her tone was careful, but honest. There was a sudden spike in intracranial pressure followed by a drop in respiratory rhythm. "We had to act fast. He's stable now, but there's been no further signs of responsiveness." John asked the questions he needed to ask, about long-term effects, possible causes, and the narrow line between deterioration and plateau. But his thoughts weren't fully in the room. He was thinking about Emily. About the recent surge in her efforts. And about the window that was slowly closing. Later that day, while reviewing surveillance footage from the hospital security office, a request granted after John's consistent involvement and legal standing as David's medical proxy, he noticed something strange. 2 nights ago, just before dawn, a nurse's badge was used to access David's room. But the nurse in question, Nurse Powell, was not on duty at the time. He called over the head of security. This badge was used. But Powell wasn't here. The guard confirmed it. The badge had been reported lost the day before, and no alert had been triggered because the system flagged the access as legitimate. The visitor had been inside David's room for less than 2 minutes. John watched the footage. The figure was small, hooded, dressed in scrubs. No visible face. No visible hands. No interaction with the patient that the camera caught. But they'd been there, close enough to touch him. To inject something. To tamper with his ventilator. He left the room without saying a word and returned to David's side. The beeping of the machines filled the air again, steady but distant. He reached for his son's hand. "Someone came for you," he said softly. "They're not done." An hour later, the hospital administrator received a formal complaint from John, followed by a legal notice that from that moment on, no one was to access David's room without his explicit, written consent. He added a private security detail of his own, 2 men he trusted from his years in the field, stationed discreetly outside the ICU door, posing as hospital staff. But the incident forced his hand. He had to accelerate everything. He met with Mark Rayner that evening to finalize their findings. "We pulled phone logs on Evan Stratton," Mark said. "He's been in contact with Emily every day since David's crash. Short calls, sometimes just seconds. Also, he's been using burner phones. We got one of the numbers from a subpoena. Guess where that number was used from 3 nights ago? Where? Inside this hospital." John sat forward, every muscle coiled. "You think he was the one with the stolen badge?" "Unlikely. He's too cautious to get his hands dirty. But he could have sent someone. Or coordinated something. Who else is he connected to? Mark pulled out a file. There's one name that keeps popping up, Brenda Keener. Nurse practitioner. Formerly licensed in Maryland. Lost her license after a malpractice claim involving unauthorized drug administration. Guess where she works now? Don't tell me it's here. Not quite. But she's on call with a private transport company that contracts for long-term care facilities. She's also tied to the same clinic Emily tried to move David to. John rubbed a hand over his face. The network was wider than he'd expected. Emily wasn't a lone manipulator, she was part of a chain. A system designed to process people like David quietly, quickly, and profitably. Start the paperwork, John said. I want them all flagged. I want Brenda investigated. I want Evan's license suspended. I want everything above board and in motion before Emily makes another move. He went home that night but didn't rest. The hospital setback haunted him. Someone had tried to reach David again. And they would try once more unless he changed the rules. The next morning, he called in one more favor, from a woman named Adriana Wolf, a federal compliance investigator he had helped years ago when her own department was nearly gutted by internal corruption. She owed him. I need a quiet audit, he said. Target, Evan Stratton and the firm he's been using to launder funds through a life insurance setup. Adriana didn't hesitate. Give me 3 days. 2, John said. And I need to know if any part of that fund has already been liquidated. If it has? Then we're not just dealing with fraud, he said. We're dealing with something more. Before the day was done, Emily made her next move. She arrived at the hospital unexpectedly, escorted by an attorney. They didn't enter David's room, but they demanded a review of his medical decisions, arguing that her spousal rights had been unlawfully ignored. The hospital deferred to legal counsel. John arrived in the middle of the meeting and walked in without invitation. This isn't about spousal rights, he said coldly. This is about a woman who has been absent for weeks and now shows up when control slips through her hands. Her lawyer protested, but John handed the administrator a folder, full documentation of Emily's accounts, her offshore activity, her attempted claim on the insurance policy, and the footage of her unauthorized visit using a stolen badge. The administrator read in silence. Then closed the folder. Until a court rules otherwise, he said, all medical decisions remain under the proxy assigned. That is Mr. Matthews. Meeting adjourned. Emily stood without a word. She didn't look at John as she left. But something in her posture told him what he already knew. She was running out of time. And she had just lost another battle. The days following Emily's failed legal maneuver moved with the cold efficiency of a counterstrike. John Matthews had expected retaliation, even desperation. Instead, what came was silence. But silence, in John's world, was rarely a sign of surrender, it was a cover for strategy. David remained unconscious, though stable. The hospital, now a fortress under John's oversight, had become a battleground of control and evidence. Security logs were reviewed hourly. Visitors were screened beyond protocol. Every nurse who entered David's room signed a paper log and was monitored discreetly. John hadn't left Washington in days. He barely slept. His life had become a carousel of meetings, surveillance reviews, and quiet, tireless digging. It was in that rhythm of tension that a nurse named Meredith approached him one morning. She was young, sharp, and had developed a habit of lingering during her shifts with David. Mr. Matthews, she said cautiously as she adjusted David's four. I don't know if this matters, but there's something I think you should know. John stood from the corner chair, alert but careful not to interrupt. Go ahead. Meredith glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. Before he was intubated the first time, David, he was trying to call someone. Almost every day. It was the same number. Always right after visiting hours ended. John's chest tightened. You remember the number? She nodded. I wrote it down. I thought, maybe it was important. She handed him a small folded note. He opened it. The number matched one of the burner lines from Lisa's apartment, the one David had registered under a separate name. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. He simply left. That afternoon, John visited Lisa again. She looked worn, her eyes haunted by the same exhaustion that had begun to carve lines into his face as well. "I need to know everything now," he told her. Not just what David said. What he was doing. What he was afraid of. And why he trusted you. Lisa nodded slowly and gestured for him to sit. She poured 2 glasses of water and pushed one toward him. "He came to me 3 months ago," she said. "Said something was wrong. He wasn't specific at first, just said he felt watched. That Emily had changed. That their finances weren't aligning. He asked for help, but not directly. He wanted someone outside of his marriage, someone who wouldn't report back to family or friends." What was he looking for? "Patterns," she said. "He gave me spreadsheets. Asked me to compare what he earned with what was going out. A lot of it didn't match. Expenses he didn't recognize. Transfers to accounts he never touched." John leaned forward. "Did he ever mention someone named Brenda Keener?" Lisa blinked. "That name?" "Yes. He said Emily was meeting with someone by that name. Thought she was part of some private care group. But then he said the woman never gave credentials. He didn't trust her." John made a mental note. He'd already had Brenda flagged, but now the personal connection was confirmed. She wasn't just involved, David had noticed her. He also said Emily was preparing for something. He found a document she tried to hide. A will. Not his. Hers. But it listed projected inheritance values, based on his death. It had numbers. Estimated payouts. And a list of contacts for financial transition. John sat still for a moment. She wrote a financial plan based on him dying? Lisa nodded. He asked me to help him build a mirror version. To hide his assets. To prepare a counter-document in case something happened to him. Where is it? Lisa stood and went to her closet. She returned with a small lockbox. Inside were printed records, contracts, handwritten notes, all in David's handwriting. Among them, a manila envelope marked, "Contingency Plan," for John. John opened it and found a letter addressed to him. The handwriting was tight, deliberate. "Dad. If you're reading this, I didn't get the chance to say goodbye. I never wanted to bring you into this, not after everything you've done for this country, for our family. But I knew if something went wrong, you'd be the only one who could finish what I started. Emily's not alone in this. She's connected to something bigger. I don't know the full scope, but I know enough to say this: I was supposed to disappear. Not die, disappear. Quietly. Legally. Financially. They were preparing to rewrite me out of my own life. There's a name I couldn't track down fully. Someone called the facilitator. They broker deals, identities, new starts. High level. If she called them, I might never be found. Stop them. D. John reread the letter 3 times. The facilitator. The term didn't appear in any of the documents he had. No digital trail. No account matching the alias. But it sounded exactly like the kind of service used by those in financial crimes to sever identities and create clean exits. That night, back at his apartment, John relayed everything to Veronica and Mark. They began scouring old FBI databases, financial crime cases, off-record testimonies. In a former case involving high-end medical fraud, there had been whispers of a broker known only through encrypted forums, a handler who managed quiet exits for individuals with compromised identities. They operated globally. But one name associated with them kept appearing on hidden logs. A woman named Celeste Vaughn. A former estate lawyer turned offshore consultant. Never charged. But often mentioned in redacted files involving identity shielding, medical redirection, and quiet patient transfers. John finally had a direction. The next morning, he confronted the administrator at the clinic Emily had tried to transfer David to. He presented documents, the failed POA, the unauthorized payment attempts, and the surveillance footage from the hospital. "I know who she tried to hire," John said. "And I know your clinic was part of the plan." The administrator, cornered and sweating, offered no resistance. "She submitted a request through an intermediary. We didn't approve it because of the inconsistencies in the paperwork. But she was persistent." "What name was used?" "Celeste Vaughn." And just like that, the silent shadow David had feared now had a face. John left the clinic and called Mark. "Find her," he said. "And find out who she works with. I want her boxed in before she finds another hospital to pull this off." For the first time in days, John didn't return to the hospital immediately. He drove instead to an overlook above the Potomac River and sat alone, David's letter in his lap. His son had seen it coming. Had tried to fight back. And now, every silence that once haunted this case was breaking. One connection at a time. The knock on Emily's hotel door came at precisely 6 o'clock in the evening. The sun had begun its descent behind the Miami skyline, painting the windows in gold. Inside her luxury suite, the air was tense, quiet but not peaceful. She had not posted to social media in over a week. No public appearances. No contact with known associates. And despite her silence, she had not fled. She was waiting. Maybe because she still believed she had control. Maybe because she had nowhere else to go. John stood outside her door, jaw tight, his expression unreadable. He didn't knock again. The door creaked open, revealing Emily in a silk robe, hair tied back, glass of wine in her hand. She did not look surprised. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice dry. John stepped inside without a word, the door closing behind him. The room smelled faintly of perfume and tension. She moved toward the minibar, topping off her glass as if expecting a conversation. "You're not here to kill me," she said, sipping. "So let's skip the theatrics." John reached into his coat and pulled out a slim black folder, placing it carefully on the table between them. Then he opened it, page by page, laying out the contents like a surgeon revealing a diagnosis. Asset transfers. Trust documentation under the alias Melissa Grant. Evan Stratton's phone logs. Offshore payments. Attempted claim on the life insurance policy. Forged power of attorney. A surveillance report tying you to Celeste Vaughn. And a hospital security breach using a stolen badge. All within 3 weeks of David's crash. Emily didn't flinch. She only raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." "I had help," John replied. "Not that it was hard." "You got sloppy." Emily took another sip of wine, then set the glass down with deliberate care. "What do you want, John? You already ruined everything. You locked my accounts. You destroyed my connections. You turned the hospital into a fortress. So what is this? One last scare tactic before you throw it all to the police?" John leaned forward slightly. "I want to know who planned the crash. And I want names." Emily let out a short, bitter laugh. "Do you think I had him run off the road? You give me too much credit. I give you exactly as much credit as a woman who built a financial escape plan before her husband's accident. Who forged signatures. Who tried to vanish him before the machines could save him. You think you know me, John? You know nothing." David wasn't the same man anymore. He was paranoid. Obsessed. Every day was a war with him. He thought I was out to get him because he couldn't control the one thing he feared, being irrelevant. "He feared you," John said calmly. "And he was right." She went silent. John stood and walked to the window, looking out over the fading city. Then he turned back. "You didn't act alone. David found a name. The facilitator. You planned a quiet erasure. Not a death. A disappearance. If he'd died naturally, it would have been perfect. No body to examine. No trail. Just grief and a closed casket. Emily sat down, slowly, legs crossed, her tone shifting. You think I wanted him dead? No. I just wanted out. We both did. You call it escape. I call it mercy. He wasn't living anymore, John. He was digging into shadows. Accusing me of lies I hadn't told yet. That house was poison. You could have walked away, John said. Instead, you forged a future built on his grave. She looked up, something hard in her eyes now. Not guilt. Not remorse. Just fatigue. You wouldn't understand. You're a man who lived in shadows. Who left his family for decades while chasing wars. You think your presence now makes you righteous? John's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He took a small USB drive from his pocket and dropped it beside the folder. That's David's backup. He left a trail you didn't find. Every call. Every wire transfer. Every meeting. Including the ones with your cousin. Including Celeste Vaughn. And one more thing, his will. The new one. Executed 2 weeks before the crash. You're no longer the beneficiary. You're not even mentioned. I am his medical proxy. And the primary executor of his estate. The impact registered visibly now. Emily's fingers tensed around the edge of the chair. You can't prove he was of sound mind. He recorded a statement, John said. On video. It's already with the family lawyer. If anything happens to me, it goes public. Along with every piece of this file. Your entire network. Evan, Celeste, Brenda. Every one of them. Emily stood now too, facing him across the room. So what now? You think I'll beg? You think I'll confess? No, John said. I think you'll listen. He stepped forward, voice low and controlled. The police will knock on your door within the week. Charges are being prepared for financial fraud, attempted medical coercion, and conspiracy to commit identity erasure. You won't be arrested tonight, but it's coming. Your lawyer will advise you to turn yourself in before then. You came all this way just to tell me that? No. I came to look in your eyes. I needed to see if you were still proud of it. She didn't blink. And that was his answer. He walked toward the door, but before opening it, he said one final thing. David showed signs of consciousness 2 days ago. He moved his hand when I said your name. That's what you're running from, isn't it? Not me. Not prison. Him. The moment he opens his eyes and remembers everything. Emily's face lost all pretense then. The glass in her hand trembled slightly. Her lips parted but no words followed. John left. In the elevator, he didn't exhale until the doors closed behind him. For the first time since returning from overseas, he felt the battle turning. Emily was exposed. And David was still fighting. 2 days after the confrontation at the hotel, John Matthews was called into the law office of Rachel Klein, the family attorney who had handled his affairs for nearly 20 years and had been David's legal counsel since his early 20s. Her voice on the phone had been calm, but firm, requesting a meeting in person. No details were shared. Only that the subject concerned David's estate. John arrived at the downtown D.C. office mid-morning. The reception area was silent, the hum of fluorescent lights the only background noise. Rachel's assistant waved him in without delay. When he stepped into the office, Rachel was already standing by the window, holding a thin folder, her expression unreadable. You're going to want to sit down for this, she said. I've been sitting in war rooms for 40 years, John replied. I'll stand. Rachel nodded, then opened the folder. We received this from a private courier this morning. It's a notarized document. Hand-delivered. Dated 9 days before David's crash. It's a revision to his will, legally sound, properly witnessed, and fully executed. I had it authenticated before calling you. John didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on her face. Rachel placed the document on the table and slid it toward him. He read. The first paragraph revoked all previous versions of David's last will and testament. The second named John Matthews as medical and legal power of attorney, with full authority to act on David's behalf during incapacitation. The third listed the disinheritance of Emily Matthews by name. She gets nothing, Rachel confirmed. No estate rights. No access to accounts. No legal standing to act on David's behalf under any capacity. It's ironclad. And there's more. She turned the page and revealed a section marked, Contingency Clauses. In the event of incapacitation due to foul play, suspected coercion, or attempted manipulation of the subject's legal rights or physical safety, the will authorized immediate investigation, complete transfer of authority to John Matthews, and, if necessary, prosecution of involved parties using David's retained private investigators and legal counsel. He anticipated something, John said quietly. He knew, Rachel replied. And he prepared for it. John took a deep breath, the weight of the paper in his hand strangely grounding. All the pieces he had gathered were beginning to align in ways even he hadn't expected. David had been ahead of him. Not just suspicious, but strategic. Quietly preparing for the moment his own life would be weaponized against him. Do you have a copy ready for the court? Rachel nodded. Filed this morning. The probate judge will confirm temporary control of all assets to you by end of day. We've already issued a cease and desist to Emily's legal team regarding any claim to David's estate or medical decisions. And the investigators? John asked. 3 firms were retained by David under separate contracts. I've already contacted them. One of them had a full dossier on a woman named Celeste Vaughn. Another tracked property in Maryland, one registered under Melissa Grant. They'll share everything with you by tomorrow. John's eyes narrowed. He was building a war chest. Rachel folded her arms. He didn't trust the system to catch up in time. He trusted you. Later that afternoon, John returned to the hospital. The nurses had grown used to his presence, and some even paused to offer quiet updates, even when nothing had changed. David was still unresponsive, still reliant on machines, still fighting some invisible war within his own body. But now, John held something no machine could detect: leverage. In David's room, he opened his laptop and reviewed the newly released files from the private investigators. The Vaughn file was the most complete. It included a list of offshore companies she had helped structure, records of at least 7 clients she had assisted in executing fraudulent medical transfers, and 2 redacted names connected to past disappearances. No convictions, but plenty of flags. Then came a set of financial documents that caught his attention: hidden accounts tied to Evan Stratton, accessed through a corporate entity called Theron Holdings. Emily was listed as a silent partner. This wasn't just opportunism. This was architecture. A system designed to bleed assets, collapse identities, and erase liabilities, all dressed up in legality. And David had seen through it. That night, John received a call from Veronica. I traced Celeste, she said. She boarded a private flight out of Key West late last night. Destination, Belize. But here's the twist. The plane was registered under a shell company tied to Evan Stratton. She's running? Maybe. Or maybe she's being relocated. Who else was on the flight? 2 passengers. One male, unidentified. Likely Evan. One female. Not Emily. John stood at the window of the hospital room, watching the streetlights flicker below. He felt the gears turning behind the silence. Let them run, he said. Veronica paused. You don't want to intercept? Not yet. Let the rope stretch. Early the next morning, an official court order was delivered to John at the hospital: temporary custodianship of David Matthews's medical and financial estate. Signed. Sealed. Enforced. With it came a notice of intent to investigate Emily Matthews for potential criminal activity, including attempted fraud and obstruction of medical decisions. An hour later, Emily's lawyer contacted Rachel Klein, requesting an emergency meeting. The message was clear. The walls were closing in. But John wasn't finished. He returned to David's room, placed the court document beside the hospital bed, and said softly, "You did this. You didn't just survive the crash, you survived the plan. And now we finish what you started." As he stood there, a faint sound cut through the room. A breath. Not from the machine. From David. His hand twitched again, twice, then stilled. It wasn't enough to raise alarms. But it was enough for John to lean closer and whisper, "She's going to pay, son. Every one of them will." The morning after David's hand twitched brought a different kind of energy into the hospital room. Subtle, but undeniable. A nurse noticed a shift in his neurological response readings and recorded a brief increase in pulse activity during a standard check. Though the movement was too small to qualify as full consciousness, the data was logged and flagged for review. John Matthews, who hadn't left the hospital overnight, stood at the corner of the room, watching the machines with renewed focus. By then, the court-appointed authority granted to him was in full effect. No one could access David, not doctors, nurses, or legal representatives, without John's signature. Emily was now completely locked out. And the legal machinery that had once felt slow and impenetrable was now turning fast, precise, and unforgiving. The Department of Health and Human Services had opened an inquiry into the private care clinic where Emily had attempted to move David. Federal interest in Celeste Vaughn's consulting activities had grown after Mark Rayner submitted a detailed file tying her to several red-flagged patient disappearances in other states. But the final spark came when a tip was delivered anonymously to a federal medical fraud investigator, a recorded conversation between Emily and Evan Stratton, discussing the life insurance payout as a guaranteed financial reset, contingent on total silence from the source. It was Lisa who had delivered the recording. She hadn't told John she'd been wired. But she had agreed to meet Emily under the pretense of clearing the air, asking questions, pretending to forgive. Emily had taken the bait, let her guard down, and revealed more than she should have. By the time the feds listened to the audio, the narrative changed. It wasn't just about fraud. It was about intent. Coordinated deception. Medical manipulation. And worst of all, possible endangerment of life for financial gain. Emily Matthews received a formal summons to appear before a grand jury the following week. When news of the investigation became public, it hit the media like wildfire. Local stations in D.C. picked up the story first. Former intelligence officer battles for son's life amidst allegations of spousal deception, but soon, national outlets began circling. Names were not released, but phrases like life insurance exploitation and unauthorized transfer attempt dominated the headlines. John stayed silent. He issued no statements. No interviews. He remained at David's side. But he kept moving behind the scenes. Mark had traced the financial trail of Evan Stratton even further, revealing that several other clients had been targeted for similar exit strategies. One was a retired veteran with early-onset dementia, another a cancer patient with no immediate family. In each case, Evan had facilitated power of attorney transfers to third parties under complex legal arrangements, eventually redirecting life insurance and estate assets through shell corporations. John gathered everything. He contacted an investigative reporter he trusted from his past intelligence work, Miles Hampton, and handed over the entire case. No names. Just a timeline. Documents. Evidence. Patterns. Enough to start a national conversation without compromising the legal process. 2 days later, a story aired on primetime news titled, "The Silent Exit: How Power of Attorney Can Be Twisted into Profitable Disappearance." That same night, John received a call from the prosecutor handling Emily's preliminary hearing. "We're recommending charges for fraudulent conveyance, attempted insurance fraud, and obstruction of medical care. If she resists, we'll add conspiracy and reckless endangerment." "She'll resist," John said. That's all she knows how to do. And if she doesn't? Then she's hoping to strike a deal. Indeed, Emily's attorney reached out the following day, requesting a conditional negotiation, immunity in exchange for full cooperation, including testimony against Evan, Celeste, and any other party involved. Rachel Klein, speaking on John's behalf, refused the first proposal. No immunity. Reduced sentencing if she talks. That's all she gets. Emily, cornered and alone, finally relented. Her statement was delivered under sealed court protection but confirmed the critical details. She had worked with Evan and Celeste to construct an exit strategy for David. The plan was never explicitly to kill him, but to isolate him, medicate him into incapacity, then transfer him to a facility where his voice, if it returned, would be irrelevant. I didn't think he'd wake up, she said in her deposition. And if he did, I figured no one would believe him. John read the transcript in silence. David was still unconscious, but something had changed. His fingers twitched more often now. His pupils reacted to light more consistently. Doctors remained cautious, but hopeful. And that hope grew when, on a cool Friday morning, a nurse stepped into John's temporary apartment just 2 blocks from the hospital with a smile she couldn't hide. He blinked. "John," she said. Not reflexively. Purposefully. Twice when we called his name. Once when we asked if he could hear. John returned to the hospital without speaking. When he entered David's room, he stood in silence for a full minute, watching. Then, for the first time in weeks, he took his son's hand, not to monitor it, but to hold it. "David," he said, voice low and steady, "if you can hear me, everything's under control. You don't have to fight alone anymore." No response came that day. But that night, the nurse called again. He squeezed my hand. 1 long press. Then 2 quick ones. John knew the code. Morse. 1 long. 2 short. Yes. The following morning, John submitted his final report to the authorities, a compilation of every document, testimony, and legal decision now fully validated by David's revised will. It included a letter requesting that David's voice be the final one heard in court, when he was ready. By then, Evan Stratton had been arrested. Celeste Vaughn, still in Belize, was under international watch, with a formal extradition request pending. Brenda Keener had lost her license permanently and faced a grand jury indictment. Emily Matthews, under bail conditions, was confined to her residence and ordered to wear an ankle monitor until trial. And John Matthews? He returned to the same hospital room, where for the first time in weeks, he saw his son's eyes, open, uncertain, but awake. Justice had not finished moving. But it was now unstoppable. David's first full sentence came 12 days after he opened his eyes. It was just after 6 o'clock in the morning, the sky outside barely turning blue, when John Matthews returned from the hospital cafeteria with a lukewarm cup of black coffee. The machines in the room were quieter now, the breathing tubes removed 2 days prior, replaced by a nasal cannula that no longer defined his son's life by machine rhythm. John had grown used to listening for patterns, heartbeat beeps, respiration intervals, but now he listened for something far more fragile: voice. David had been tracking movement with his eyes for nearly a week. Blinking on command. Light squeezing of fingers. But this morning, as John approached the bed and sat in the chair beside him, his son's lips moved. Slowly. Carefully. Then, with the faintest rasp. "Where is she?" The voice was gravel and hesitation. But the clarity behind it hit John with more force than anything he had heard in years. He leaned forward, setting the coffee down. "She's gone, son," he said quietly. "She tried. But we stopped her." David blinked. He tried to say something else but only managed a dry breath. John poured a glass of water, lifted the straw to his son's mouth, and waited as David took a few slow sips. When he leaned back again, John didn't ask questions. He simply watched. "She planned it?" David murmured. John nodded. "Not alone. But yes. David closed his eyes for a moment. Then opened them again, more focused this time. "I tried to warn someone," he said. "You did," John answered. "You warned Lisa. You left files. You changed your will. You fought back in the only way you could." David's eyes filled, but no tears fell. "I didn't think I'd wake up." "You almost didn't," John said. "But you did. And now everything's going to change." The weeks that followed were slow and clinical but filled with meaning. David's strength returned in fragments, short walks with assistants, meals by himself, extended conversations that began to stretch beyond fear and into memory. He asked questions about the investigation, about Emily's trial, about the fate of the others. John never avoided the truth, but he spared no energy to make it darker than it had already been. "Emily took a plea," John said one afternoon. "No jail time, but a record. Full confession. Testified against the others. Evan will serve time. Celeste will be extradited. The others are collapsing like dominoes." David absorbed it all quietly. "What about Lisa?" he asked once. "She saved you. She recorded Emily. She handed over the files you left. She did everything right." David nodded. There was something else in his eyes, something private. The press had continued to circle, but without David's name released publicly, and with no formal interviews, the story was left to the whispers of media forums and podcasts. Rachel Klein managed the legal noise with quiet brilliance. John declined every request for public comment. One morning, after a physical therapy session, David looked at his father as they sat by the window overlooking the hospital courtyard. "I don't know how to come back from this." "You don't," John said. David glanced at him. "You rebuild instead." "I feel hollow," David admitted. "You're not," John said. "You're scarred. Not hollow. There's a difference." They sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the distant hum of traffic and birds. Then David said, "Did you ever feel this way after everything you saw overseas?" John didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Every single day. But then I remembered that silence isn't just about what you lose. It's what you protect. What you carry forward." David nodded slowly. "Do you ever forgive?" "You don't need to," John replied. "You just stop carrying it." On David's last day in the hospital, he dressed slowly, carefully, his muscles still learning how to trust again. John waited by the door, holding his coat. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The ride home was quiet, the city sliding by outside the windows, familiar but changed. When they arrived at the townhouse, John helped him up the steps, and they stood for a moment in the open doorway. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar and dust. The past still lived there, but so did something else. Something reclaimable. John didn't stay the night. He left quietly after making sure the alarms worked and the locks were secure. David thanked him without words, just a look. John drove home through the dark, back to his own silence. But this one wasn't heavy. It was earned. 3 months later, David testified remotely in the final hearing against Evan Stratton. His statement was precise, unshaking. He named names. Recounted what he remembered. Explained how he discovered the fraud. His voice was the final key in the case. Evan was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. Celeste Vaughn was extradited and accepted a deal for 5, with a lifetime ban on financial service work. Emily Matthews relocated under a changed name, her reputation shattered, her access to wealth revoked, her name now a warning in legal circles. Lisa moved to the West Coast. She and David remained in contact, slowly, with caution and understanding. Nothing rushed. Nothing assumed. John visited David every weekend. They didn't talk much about what happened. They didn't need to. Because some silences weren't signs of absence. Some silences meant peace. And peace, after war, was worth more than gold.